Hello, everyone. My name is Mari Carmen Garza. I'm the Chief of Programs at the Tahray Justice Center, an interdisciplinary and trauma-informed legal organization that serves immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. I am also the chair of the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence. And today, on behalf of the Commission and in partnership with the ABA Center on Children and the Law and the ABA Commission on Homelessness and Poverty, it is my honor to welcome you to our very first ever Write and Tell event, where we uplift the written work of the scholars and leaders in our field. The book that we will be discussing today is Together Unbroken: Stories, Law, Practice, and Healing at the Intersections of Domestic Violence and Child Welfare by author Sara Block. A little bit about Sara. Sara Block is the Managing Director of Advocacy and Partnership at Ascend Justice, where she focuses on policy and systemic reform that impact families experiencing domestic violence. Sara is also an academic director for the Child and Family Law programs at Loyola University School of Law. In the Master's of Jurisprudence in Child and Law program at Loyola, Sara teaches child welfare law and policy and juvenile justice law policy. Sara was a Skadden Fellow at the Legal Assistance Foundation of Metropolitan Chicago, with a fellowship focusing on the intersection of domestic violence and child welfare. Sara was awarded the Chicago Metropolitan Battered Women's Network Outstanding Partnership Award, the Family Defense Center's Major Litigation Award for her involvement in Julie Q versus DCFS, and the Jewish United Fund's 36 Under 36 Award. Sara received her JD magna cum laude from Loyola University Chicago School of Law in 2007, where she was a child law fellow and the features editor of the Children's Legal Right Journal. Sara dedicated her book to the memory of AK and her daughter VK, who experienced love, domestic violence, the child welfare, and tragically a murder, and to honor her parents who showed her the truest meaning of family, and to her husband and daughters for being the most treasured family. Thank you, Sara, for joining us today for our very first Write and Tell. I know that you've already heard this, but because of our conversations with you about your book, your dedication to telling stories, you parked this entire series for us. So let's get to it.
Wonderful.
Tell us, why did you write this book?
Well, I want to thank you so much for having me. This is a really special time to talk about the book, and I appreciate the ABA and the various commissions and centers that are co-sponsoring. So thank you so much, and to all of you who are spending the next 30 minutes with us. Hopefully you're eating lunch or having a snack or something like that, but sit back and I hope you'll enjoy the conversation. So this book really came to me, and it was really a wonderful gift that did. I had written a chapter in the ABA publication called The Lawyer's Handbook: The Impact of Domestic Violence on Your Legal Practice. And I was asked to write that chapter on the intersection of child welfare and domestic violence. And to be very honest, I just submitted the chapter and I thought that would be it. And there was some vision at the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence that this could actually be turned into a book. And I like to make the joke that this might be like Lin-Manuel Miranda reading the Hamilton biography and thinking it could be a hip hop musical. Not that my book is a hip hop musical, but it was wonderful vision that came from that book, from that chapter, that really was the impetus for this book. And when someone offers to publish a book that you're going to write, the answer is yes. And so I said yes wholeheartedly. Maybe with a little trepidation, because I had never written a book before, to be very honest, but it really was an enormous gift. And I sort of felt that it was a gift throughout the entire time that I was writing. And I had the support of the ABA throughout the whole process.
Well, let me tell you, your book is a true gift. Having read it, I wish this was mandatory reading for anybody that does this kind of work. So thank you.
Thank you.
For our broader audience, I would love for you to tell us what your book addresses.
Yeah. So the book is pretty aspirational, and it talks a lot about the history of child welfare, framework of child welfare, and then specifically about the issues that are specific to the intersection of how child welfare responds to domestic violence. And there are some big issues that child welfare historically and contemporaneously are asking us and sort of demanding of us to question right now. And so the book addresses that. So it talks about the prevalence of domestic violence in child welfare cases. It really grapples with how hard and complicated these cases are. And it thinks about how our responses can be different. And the lens is through domestic violence and child welfare. But if we can get this right, if we can get this intersection where families are experiencing domestic violence as well as potentially other issues, if child welfare can really have an effective response there, then we can use those lessons to inform and improve more broadly child welfare interventions. And child welfare is challenged right now. It's challenged. We really cannot talk about child welfare without talking about the disproportionality and disparity that families of color experience in the child welfare system. There's a historical nature to child welfare that has sort of rooted the only tool or the core tool in removal, even though removal might be necessary in really the minority of cases. And we know that the vast majority of cases are coming in for issues of neglect, domestic violence, mental health struggles, substance abuse, poverty, other things like that. Yet the only tool we have is removal. And there is a disconnect between the tool that child welfare relies upon and the experiences of families and really what those families need. If you take that context, then you think about how is child welfare responding to families experiencing domestic violence. And sort of across the country, and this is not pointing fingers at one system or one state, but across the country, child welfare struggles to really understand domestic violence, to identify the roles of who the adult survivor of domestic violence is, who the parent who's using violence and coercive control is. It really struggles to engage with the person who's causing the violence and help develop accountability avenues there. It often is a very punitive response to adult survivors, in which they're indicated or deemed to be neglectful. Children are oftentimes removed from their families, and specifically the adult survivor, which is really, really harmful and traumatic to them. Removal is traumatic to most children, but when there's domestic violence occurring, it's increasingly traumatic. And then what really happens is the child is removed from the main source of their healing, which is the adult survivor. And so the system in itself is compounding and perpetuating trauma. And so we see all of these things happening, and we then say, what can we do about it? And this book really is that solution. And it's not, my solution is not rocket science. It's not something that, they're not concepts that I've pulled out of thin air, but it's really sort of a transformation in how the system approaches families. And I believe that this topic deserves that kind of attention. And child welfare has only recently really come into sort of more commonplace narrative and dialogue. And I'm glad it's there because shining a spotlight on a system that really needs to improve, but it can't improve alone. It has to improve and reform in collaboration and partnership.
Thank you for that. And I think for me, that was, obviously learning about the historical context of the child welfare system was fascinating. I mean, I know where we are now. I've been in this system as an advocate for survivors who are struggling, but, did not know the origins. And to me, that was incredible information to learn. But I love that hopefulness and like giving an actual solution of how we can actually make this a better system for all who are experiencing domestic violence and that are also in the child welfare system. But can you tell us historically what has been the treatment or, the responses to domestic violence survivors in the child welfare system?
So these cases are some of the most prevalent and the hardest to navigate, sort of self-admittedly from many child welfare workers. And these cases can be really scary. And the people who are oftentimes the most responsive, which are the adult survivors, are not the people that are in the most control over keeping their children safe. And so what's really sort of evolved, unfortunately, is a lot of victim blaming, a a lot of sort of holding out for this perfect victim. So we're going to only acknowledge the actions of a mother who didn't stay too long, left soon enough, never returned. And that perfect victim, however we conceive of it, has never existed. She doesn't exist today, and she never has. And so what the system does is sort of take this idea that domestic violence occurs and therefore mom is neglectful and therefore children are harmed and should be removed. And it's sort of this circular logic. And it really ignores all of the things that adult survivors do each and every day to keep their children safe, both in meeting their basic needs as well as responding and trying to mitigate the risk of harm to their children. And so there's no minimization of the impact of domestic violence on families, but it's the response. It's what do families actually need? And families, especially the adult survivor and children, they need partnership, they need support, they need connection to concrete supports and services, and they need each other. Most of all, they need each other. And so our system should respond in that way. And when we don't, as I mentioned earlier, we're perpetuating compounding trauma, and we are also not taking opportunities to interrupt cycles of violence. And that occurs through healing. And if people aren't given the chance to heal and the opportunity to truly heal from the trauma, that is when violence and abuse perpetuates into the future. And I should say that, just qualify that most people who are harmed don't harm others, but the vast majority of people who harm have been harmed themselves. So that's a really important distinction that I want to make true. And so we, as a sort of policy matter, our systems should be vehicles of healing. And if they can't be that, they shouldn't impede healing at a minimum. And so that really is sort of the historic response. And it gets perpetuated in families each and every day, in communities, in court systems. And that's really what we need to push against.
Thank you. Thank you, Sara. And we're starting to get some responses. Dr. Eloisa Peta, so true. There's a lack of accountability for the systems that neglect to support families.
Mm-hmm.
Just a matter of housekeeping. If there are questions, we are able to see your responses and your feedback. Thank you for that. We're going to address questions at the end of our conversation, but please do keep them coming in, as well as your comments, as that will allow us to know where we can keep going in what direction. So one of the things that I absolutely loved about your book is the way that you use stories throughout it. Why was it important for you to share the message of this book through stories?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and obviously the first word of the subtitle is stories. And so when I received the invitation to write the book, I spoke with a lot of people sort of in that planning phase about, I have this platform now, and what should I do with this platform? And really wanting to hear from people who I very much respect about what this book could be. And someone said to me, just as at a minimum, affect hearts and minds. And I took that very seriously. And then it took about 9 months for me to really bring all the ideas together and outline the book and sort of bring it to life in that way. But stories became the root and the core of the book. And you enter every chapter through stories, through meeting people that I think you quickly come to care about. And I want to say that every single person whose story is shared in the book was shared with not only their consent, but their active participation, their review, their approval. It was a very iterative process. The only people whose stories are shared who are people who, without their consent, are people who are deceased. And there were only two people like that. But I was able to share their stories in ways that I felt was very true to them. And so that process itself of how do you share a survivor story in this way? And the book frames out the different stages of healing. And the way that I describe them is that there are 3 stages: safety, narrative, and connection. And so putting together your own story of trauma and survival and resilience and growth is part of that healing process. So I went into this once I said, okay, my book needs to be rooted in stories. How am I going to do this in a way that is authentic to the message of the book and what I'm hoping to achieve? And that was really to have a lens on how can my effort here help facilitate healing? And I'm not saying that I'm a trauma therapist or a practitioner, so I'm not overstating my importance, but it was very important to me that the process of sharing a story to somebody else, then having it filter back through my lens, shared with the openness and willingness to make any and all changes that someone wanted, take things out, put things in, and engage in that process with them, then have something stand sort of on its own was very healing for the people who were participating. It added this additional layer of narrative to that part of the healing process. And the response I got from them was sort of affirmed that aspiration had manifested for all of them. And so the healing aspect was incredibly important. But then why are stories important to the reader? And not only is it to change hearts and minds, but it really is intended to be a counterpoint to the very narrow way that child welfare often views families. And I'm a firm believer that the more you get to know somebody in the details, in really getting to know them, the less fear you have, the less hesitation you have, the more trust you have, the more like you have for them, the more respect. And so that is sort of a counterpoint to sort of the very narrow way that child welfare has historically viewed families. And I'll share that when I was writing the story, so in my writing process, I actually did all of my interviews first and then wrote all the stories. And at the end of writing all the stories, I had a full book just in stories. And the book, as you read, is more than just the stories. And so I had this sort of need to tell a complete story. And that sort of resulted in the length of many of the first drafts of the stories. And the book, once I wrote the full manuscript, it would have resulted in a 1,200-page book, which I don't think anyone should have to read on any topic. And so I obviously needed to edit. And it was very hard for me to edit the stories because I wanted to tell this complete story. And then Isabel, who is one of the characters you meet throughout the book, I know Isabel very well. And every time we spoke, I learned something new about Isabel. And it was this moment of pause to say, there is never a complete story. And there's people's stories, all of the people in the book, their stories are ongoing. And even though I thought I told Isabel's story completely, I didn't. And that's okay. And so it gave me some grace to say what can be included, what cannot be included. And that was done also in partnership with the survivors who shared their story.
Well, thank you. I know for me, hearing and reading the stories of these survivors that you spoke of from a real strengths-based perspective, yes. Like I was reading, I mean, my book has like exclamations and like, oh my God, like I can't believe this is exactly what I've seen. But, seeing each one of the survivors with their strengths and I mean, just how you described them was so powerful. I felt like I was talking to them and like I really enjoyed, going through that process and rooting for them through your storytelling. In your book, you said something that I thought was really peculiar, but I think it's so important for the work that we do. And you described it beautifully in the book, but the danger of a single narrative. And if you can talk a little bit more about that for those that may not have yet read it, because I think in the work that we do when we are working with survivors of violence, I think that this is a real true danger.
Yeah, it's such a good question. And just to sort of piggyback off your comments about the survivors who you met, and it is from a very hope-based, strength-based perspective in sharing their stories, but they're not exceptional survivors. They're every survivor. I would say every single person who's interacting with the child welfare system, who's involved who's experiencing domestic violence, has a story to be told. So these are the people whose voices were able to be lifted up through this book, but they're not exceptional in the sense of like unique. They are representative of the vast majority of survivors. Now, the counterpoint to that is that single narrative story. And we want to make sure that we're not telling ourselves a story, either positive or negative, about a group of people. So the danger of a single story is that it causes you to then to form bias or can be rooted in bias and to sort of predict what should be happening with a family. So for child welfare, the danger of a single story is this mom is just like the mom I met 3 weeks ago. She went back. This mom's going back and yanking her kids. Or I've been to this house 4 times now. I know in the 5th time she's going back, her kids are getting removed. that's the danger of a single story. From the advocacy perspective, the danger of a single story is that we sort of lose the uniqueness of everyone that we're working with. And so the counterpoint to that is to really get to know individuals and to really challenge some of our constructions, our moral constructions and judgments about why people are the way they are, why they make the choices they make. And at this intersection of domestic violence and child welfare are layers of moral construction. This is a concept that Kiara Bridges coined, and it's really, really poignant here. And she talks a lot about the moral constructions of race and gender and poverty. And then now you layer on domestic violence, and there's so many moral judgments about why someone is where they are. What mistakes did they make to get themselves there? And so the danger of a single story is that it affirms all of those biases. But when we deviate from a single story, when we start to get to know people and who they truly are, then that is the antidote to these moral constructions and biases that are really infiltrating so much of our response.
Well, thank you, because you just let me into the very next question about these moral constructs, and specifically as they impact child welfare, the moral construct of poverty, race, and domestic violence. How do they hurt? I mean, how do they hurt and harm families that are involved in the system?
That when we think about bias, and we all have biases, we all have judgments, and we have to be self-reflective of where do those come from. And I think moral construction is a really good way to understand that. And especially we can take sort of the idea of domestic violence and how we might morally construct against someone who is a survivor of domestic violence. We would say, I would never let myself be abused. If I'm hit once, I'm leaving. How can she stay? She must not care about her kids. Those are all sort of the biases that we might bring to our perception, and that is going to impact how the system responds. And there's a really interesting parallel between like how do we hold the system responsible for its obligation to families, and especially in shifting practice, and how do we deal with individuals in this system. And in thinking about this topic, it really caused me to draw the parallel between how we view individuals who use violence and coercive control and the systems in which that is occurring in. And with child welfare, there are very well-intentioned people working in child welfare who have a very, very difficult job and burdens to carry that most of us who are on child welfare do not carry. The safety of children is not on our shoulders in the same way it is on theirs. But we have to think about the system it's occurring within. It's occurring within a system that has historically been rooting in child saving, in responding to families who are poor, immigrant families living on the streets in the 1880s. And that is what we're carrying with us. And so we really have to think about that differently. And so those individuals are existing in a system that's very challenged for those ways. Just as people who use violence and coercive control are existing in systems and communities and societies that enable that to happen. So it's both individual responsibility and acknowledging the context that it's occurring in.
Thank you. I mean, I know that was reading through that historical context and how we're still dealing with the origins of the system, even now, was really eye-opening to me. Now, in your book, you referred to the Green Book. And for those who, I know this is something that many of us who are working in the field are very familiar with, but for those who may be unfamiliar, can you tell us what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say a little bit about one of the chapters in the book really tries to capture some history that's never really been documented in a book before. And part of that history is the Green Book, seen through the eyes of mainly of Susan Schechter with other stories interwoven. But the Green Book was published in 1999. It was published by the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And it's a green cover, but its official name is Effective Interventions in Domestic Violence and Child Maltreatment Cases, Guidelines for Policy and Practice. And so really when you learn in the book that there was a sort of a push and pull within the battered women's movement at the time in the 80s and 90s about how child welfare should respond and what role does the Battered Women's Movement have in responding to children. And for a while, the Battered Women's Movement said, well, this is not our space, child welfare, you do it. And then child welfare started doing in ways that the Battered Women's Movement was not happy about. So then they said, okay, now we need to be involved. And so the Green Book is kind of the resolution of that, of saying, what do we know, what works between domestic violence, child welfare, and the courts? And so it was a book that was written by Susan Schechter and Jeffrey Edlison with a strong advisory council behind them. And it really guides best practice about how domestic violence, child welfare, and court should work. And the main message, and there was actually some demonstration sites that followed from the Green Book, that's part of the Green Book initiative. And the main message of the Green Book is that collaboration is needed. No one system can address the issues alone. No one system should be mandated to. And so it's really collaboration is key. And then there was sort of some follow-up to the Green Book that just actually ended about a year ago, in which the Children's Bureau created a Quality Improvement Center on Domestic Violence and Child Welfare. And there was some sort of additional layers added on to collaboration. So collaboration plus what? What is sort of the philosophy of working together with families? And so now we really have sort of a more complete idea about what really are the best practices at this intersection.
Thanks, Sarah. And I know there's so much, and I can probably sit here and talk to you for hours. I know we already have, but I want to make sure, our viewers are getting some of the information that's so important. I think one of the biggest takeaways, and I think this is like something that you can answer, what is the best way to ensure the safety and well-being of a child when there is domestic violence in the home?
Yeah. So a great question. And I'll put it in the context of sort of the themes of the book about solution, then answer that very practical question. So sort of the approach in the book that I talk about is sort of being the radical transformation that the system needs is for the system to be trauma-informed, strength-based, family-centered, and equity-focused. And believe me, we go into what each of those means in great detail in the book. But then practically, what does that actually mean for families? And what it means is that families who are experiencing domestic violence, the adult survivor needs to be partnered with from whatever the systemic intervention is to help meet her needs and her children's needs. And that is a partnership. That is not a mandate. It is not punitive. It is, we know that you have done so much and we are here to help support that. And many other systems might have failed you and you might not be able to trust other systems, but we are here to partner with you. And then it's a connection with concrete supports and services. And to really get at what are the needs. And I will remember there is in the book that you read, Patricia Savedo, she was one of my very first clients. And I missed that really what she needed was to get her driver's license. And I didn't know, I was her lawyer and we had a successful case, but I missed that. And getting her driver's license would have been critical to her ability to feel that she had more control over her life. So getting to those details about what really the family needs, and then specifically ensuring that the family has a pathway to healing. And that looks so many different ways. There's no single story. Individuals will find sources of healing in their culture and identity and different forms of connection. And we need to be problem solvers and connectors, but really rooted in what families need and want. And
Thanks, Sarah.
Value. I think that's the key core that every family, even families who are struggling in significant ways, value in those families and to their children.
Most definitely. And I cannot agree more with you than that. And I know we're running out of time, but just for folks that want to read this book, for me, it's how you humanize. You mentioned Susan Schechter, right, who is like the founding mother of some of this work. And you actually spent time with all the individuals that have been crafting, what we have now in this, aspirational way that we can actually do this work. And not only did you meet with all of and talk to the individuals that have been crafting this work, like Molly McGrath Tierney, Susan, who we just mentioned, and who may she rest in peace, Betsy McAllister Groves, Liz Roberts, Ruby White Star, who is somebody that I know, and I didn't know the extent of her story until I read your book. And then also talking through all of the survivors, right, that you talk about. Like, I had not heard about Charlene Nicholson, who is the plaintiff that we know in the Nicholson case. And I've been reading this decision for years. So really, it was in a different light that I have been doing it as, somebody who's a practicing lawyer. But storytelling is definitely the key of what we do as lawyers. And this book was such a keen reflection of that. And I know we just had a code really quick for those of you who would like to get this book and purchase this book. Read it. It's definitely something that will help you in the work that you do. You can get a code by clicking on that link. And actually, you should also be seeing a barcode now appearing. So, Sarah, we're running out of time. So what would be your last thing that you would want to say about the book for our audience today?
Well, thank you. And I appreciate the thoughtfulness of your questions and sort of the enthusiasm that you're bringing to reading it. And I would say the book has resonance and accessibility to so many different people. I think those of you who are on this in this meeting because this is your profession, I encourage you to read it. For those of you who like to read nonfiction, I believe the book is really accessible to just nonfiction readers who like to read about social justice. And really, what you will walk away from the book, you will feel hopeful. You will feel connected to the people you have met. There's this really interesting line that gets blurred between those who have impacted the system and those who have been impacted. And those who have been impacted are now impacting the system. And I think that is really such a poignant message of the book. And if you read the book, please reach out to me. I really, really enjoy hearing what resonates with each reader. It's different. People take away different aspects of it, but I would love to engage in more conversation, either individually with your organizations, just with you and a group of people. So please take me up on that opportunity, and I really, really hope you'll enjoy the book.
Definitely. I think there's a request for training for legal service providers. So perhaps this is something that we could look into to do further. So with that, unfortunately, we've run out of time. So I want to thank you again, Sara, for sharing your book, your experiences with us. Thank you again to the survivors who shared their stories with Sara so that we can learn from you. Thank you to the ABA, Center on Children and the Law, and the Commission on Homelessness and Poverty for your support. For those of you who would like to keep in touch with the Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence, to learn more about our future programming, and to leave feedback about this event, please use the link being dropped in the chat now. With that link, you will also receive the discount code that I spoke about, and you can purchase Sara's book. We hope to see you again on May the 22nd, 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 Eastern Time for our next Write and Tell, which will be on May 22nd with author, advocate, and survivor Ruth Glenn. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Sara.